So Mongolia for a long time in the 2000s was doing pretty well actually. They had huge growth in their economy. It was called the Mongolian Miracle, so their economy really dramatically grew mainly due to rising prices of commodities. So after the global recession in 2008, commodity prices skyrocketed around the world. Latin America, as we know, benefited from this, but Mongolia did as well, and it's not as well known because people don't really study Mongolia very well. But from about 2010 to 2017, they were doing very, very well with their economy. However, as the commodities boom burst, as booms tend to, Mongolia suffered tremendously because of that, and their economy basically collapsed. And as a result, they had to secure a loan from the International Monetary Fund for about $5 billion, and $3 billion of that was a credit swap with China. So they gave a lot of economic control to China, which only further intertwined their economic dependence on the People's Republic of China. So the Mongolian economy has stabilized since then and has recovered a bit, but they don't have the same benefits that they had. And as we know, with commodities-based economies, they're very susceptible to rising and falling prices, so it's not very stable as compared to a manufacturing or even an industry-based economy. So Mongolia has some issues with their infrastructure and jobs, as we talked about. So their economy used to be based on traditional nomadic agriculture. So up until about the early 2000s, two-thirds of all Mongolians were still nomadic herders. So they would just, wander the Great Plains of Mongolia with their herds and sell their meat or livestock or cheese or milk or whatever. And they live in yurts, which are like those collapsible like hut houses. They would just kind of do their thing, living as they had for thousands of years. However, they've transitioned now from agriculture to mining. There are still some wandering nomads, but it's not as common anymore. And now they're a mining-based economy because Mongolia has the world's largest reserve of rare earth minerals. A lot of the stuff is like what we need in electronics, so all microchips require certain elements, and nowhere else in the world are they as prevalent as in Mongolia. However, their mining industry is kind of underdeveloped. They don't have the funding needed because it takes a lot of expensive equipment and expertise to effectively mine these materials. So China's been responsible for funding a lot of that um, resources, and a lot of it, like I said, 85% is exported to China. Mongolia may suffer from the issue of the resource curse that we've studied. When a country is too dependent on one resource, it can there can be an issue when that resource price drops or if they run out. So that's kind of something they need to worry about. Mongolia has not some issues with its defense, I would say, but there's truly some opportunities for growth in their defense. So they are a non-nuclear state. So in the Mongolian constitution, they're extraordinarily anti-nuclear power. They are very connected to nature and the natural environment, so they really oppose any use of nuclear forces, even nuclear energy. They don't want to touch it. But they're surrounded by nuclear powers, right? China and Russia are both nuclear armed states, and part of their constitution also says that Mongolia will never be part of the nuclear power politics of states. So they want nothing to do with it. They have a very small army. Their army is only about 10,000 people. And that's it. They don't have a navy because they're landlocked. They don't have an air force. Really, they don't have like a marine corps. So a very small army, and they often have a weak control of their borders. They share a very long border with both Russia and China, and they can't enforce their borders very well. So there's not a huge issue with like immigration per se, but there are issues with um, companies coming in and taking resources from Mongolia and then going back to either Russia or China, and it's hard for them to defend it. And then there are some environmental issues in Mongolia as well. So there's a lot of unregulated mining, and it's harming their environment dramatically. Um, this is leading to a lot of desertification in Mongolia, where the grasslands that have supported herding stocks for thousands of years are now drying up because of climate change and the impacts of unregulated mining. So it's kind of really harming their environment. Mongolia suffers from harsh winters called zuds, and what those are they're especially harsh winters that combine blizzards and drought, and it kills like thousands of livestock. Like thousands to hundreds of thousands, and even the harsher ones, millions of livestock will just die immediately, which is challenging, especially when a lot of their economy still is kind of dependent on agriculture and livestock and herding. A lot of climate refugees are now leaving the plains and going to the cities. Mongolia only has one main major city called Ulaanbaatar, which is also their capital, and 1 million people live there, and they have a population of only 3 million. So 1 in 3 people live in the cities, but the city or live in Ulaanbaatar, but the city cannot hold everyone. So there's a lot of slums that are kind of set out on the outskirts of the cities where climate refugees have just brought their yurts and just set them out, and there's a lot of crime and corruption and violence that goes on there because like any other really poor, underdeveloped economic area, there's a lot of crime and such associated with it. So climate change is really affecting Mongolia pretty severely. Okay, so now let's talk about Mongolian-Chinese relations. So we can go back ancient history to Genghis Khan and his grandson Kublai Khan, who conquered all of China and established a Yuan dynasty in China, and that was one of China's golden ages under Kublai Khan because he conquered China but embraced Chinese culture and wisdom and learned to speak Mandarin and like really adopted Chinese practices and such. That's why actually the currency in China is called the yuan because it was one of their golden ages. But jumping back, so Mongolia broke away from China in 1911 with the ending of the Qing dynasty. And then after World War II, China had their civil war between the Reds and the Whites, right? The communists and the nationalists. And nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and obviously communists under Mao Zedong. After Mao Zedong won the civil war in 1949, China retained control over Inner Mongolia, and it became a province. And they were thinking of going after Outer Mongolia as well to absorb it back into China, but they were too weak after the civil war, so they didn't pursue it. Mongolia kind of limited their relations with China during the during the Cold War rather, because they were so closely allied under the Soviet Union as a satellite state. In about the mid '60s, you had the Sino-Russian split, where China and the Soviet Union differed ideologically on their idea of communism, so they split apart, and they didn't really have great relations with each other. So Mongolia just fell under Soviet policy in that area. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War, China and Mongolia resumed relations because they did share a lot of common history and background, having been so intertwined ever since the first Mongol conquests in the 13th century. So they established diplomatic and economic relations, and now, as we said before, exports to China make up 85% of all Mongolian exports, so it's pretty tense. So Russian-Mongolian relations, again going back, Mongolia conquered all of Russia, the only nation to successfully invade Russia in the winter, where Hitler and Napoleon failed. Mongolia did it, and they ruled Russia for a while. They kind of broke the like Russian city-state model that was operating before by forcing all the princes to come into allegiance with Russia or with Mongolia, and they had to pay tribute and taxes to them, but so it changed a lot of how Russians see themselves, and it kind of helped to unite Russia because Mongolia just like cobbled together all these like different states together. And it's actually an interesting story how Russia broke apart from Mongolia. So the Russian princes, they wanted to break away from Mongolia, and they kind of like gathered their army together, and they went to meet the Mongolian army, the imperial army, and they were on opposite sides of a river just outside of Moscow, I think. And the Mongolian army like stared down the Russian army, and the Russian army stared down them, and then the armies decided like we don't really want to fight that much. It's just not worth it. So the leaders of the armies like met in the river and discussed a peace treaty, and they just broke apart, and that's how Russia became independent. Which is just weird to think that you would just gather your army and just look at each other and be like, nah, not today. But so Russia broke free of Mongolia, and then that's kind of what kickstarted the Russian modernization process under like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and all the different leaders of Russia who were trying to catch up. And that's also a lot of the reason why Russia was so far behind the rest of Western Europe. It was because they had lived for so long under Mongolian rule, and they weren't really allowed to develop. So it kind of explains how Russia, in their history, they were always kind of playing like the catch-up game. So in the 1920s, the USSR absorbed Mongolia as their first satellite state, as we talked about. So they became the prototype for the rest of Eastern Europe. We talked about how the Soviets had attempted to purge Buddhism throughout Mongolia, killing anywhere between 25 to 60,000 people at a time when their population was only 600,000. So it was a severe blow to Mongolians. Mongolia underwent a peaceful transition to democracy in the 90s. There was very peaceful. It was unlike Yugoslavia or Bosnia or anything, and it was like a great example of how a state could become democratic. But it's interesting because Mongolia in its history had never ever been a democracy. Like literally since the conception of like Mongolia, there was never ever a time where it was a democracy. So this is their first foray into it, which we'll get into. Modern day President Putin has advocated often for a greater Russian Mongolian allegiance. Um, there's different ways you can think about it. Is it because he thinks that Mongolia can help Russia, or is it because he wants to reduce Chinese influence on Mongolia? Putin plays his own game, and we all just kind of guess his motivations. But several times he's advocated for greater economic and military connections. And then Mongolia has an interesting history with Russia. They were occupied by Russia. There were thousands of troops in Mongolia during the time, but Mongolians are they're pretty progressive, a pretty progressive people. They're very adaptable. They've gone through so many changes in their history, so they kind of adapt. So you might think that Mongolians harbor a lot of resentment against Russia for what they did, but they really don't. Mongolians they're hardy, right? They're tough people. Ulaanbaatar is the coldest capital city in the world. Average temperature is 0 degrees Celsius there. So Mongolians do what they have to survive, and so that's kind of explains why they don't hold as much grudge. They don't hold as much of a grudge against Russia as you might think they would. Okay, and then let's talk about the U.S.-Mongolian relations. So the U.S. had pretty limited interactions with Mongolia prior to their independence from the Soviet Union. In the 20s, they had the U.S. had a small consulate in northern Mongolia, which kind of dealt with trade matters in inner and outer Mongolia. But it opened in 1920, and I think it closed in 1927 once like the Soviet solidification was finished. So we really didn't have much of a diplomatic presence there for a while. And then we didn't have any diplomacy until 1987 in Mongolia because we didn't really have much diplomatic relations with Soviet nations. So in 87, a consulate opens in Ulaanbaatar. This is as like Mongolia wasn't free of the Soviet Union yet, but their grip was definitely weakening. So we had started our first consulate, and we were actually the 100th country in the world to open a consulate in Mongolia. So we're kind of late to the party, but we've made up for it since. As Mongolia transitioned to democracy, they asked the United States for help because we are, the most prototypical democracy in the world. So the U.S. sent over a lot of advisors and NGOs and government people to assist Mongolia in their transition. We helped Mongolians to kind of draft a constitution and to set up multi-party elections and stuff. So they were and the Mongolians were very active in seeking out United States help. Like we weren't going to go in there right away because they had just transitioned. So they really had to ask us to go. So we were kind of oddly respectful of that instead of just trying to send in advisors and stuff. So Mongolia views the United States as a third neighbor, and that's a really important policy for them. It's their third neighbor policy. So they only have two neighbors geographically, right? Russia and China. But there are a few states that they consider third neighbors. The United States is like the number one third neighbor, and then you have India, Great Britain, Sweden, France, and those are like countries that Mongolia like ideologically agrees with a lot. Countries that they would like to be closer with, even if they are separated by physical borders. So the U.S. and Mongolia are really great allies. Interestingly, in 2003, Mongolia sent 180 of their soldiers to assist the United States in Iraq. And this is kind of significant because it was at a time when it was deeply unpopular to be in the Iraq War. The U.S. had its coalition of the willing with President Bush, aided by the U.K. I think it was Tony Blair was prime minister at the time, and there were some allies as well in the Middle East, but that was it. Like no one really wanted to help us, but Mongolia, they voluntarily sent soldiers to help in Iraq. The U.S. didn't ask for them; they didn't ask Mongolia for anything, but it shows their commitment. And Mongolians fought and died in the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, so there's been pretty good cooperation there, which is nice for them to send soldiers when they're already such a small country. So the U.S. and Mongolia, they have pretty strong relations, but in my paper, I advocate that they could be better and it would benefit each country. Okay, so let's talk about the mutual benefits of economic alliance. So if the U.S. invests more deeply in Mongolian infrastructure and their mining industry, the U.S. can gain access to Mongolian minerals. These minerals are really important, like I said, in our our increasingly digital world. They make cell phones and computers and satellites and robots, and they make everything work. You need these metals because, right, they're conductors of electricity. That's about all the engineering I know. But you need these minerals, and right now Mongolia sells a lot of it to China because they're Chinese mining companies that set them up. But if we get access to the mining, then the U.S. can benefit from it. And right now, the U.S. buys a lot of minerals from China because China also has a lot of deposits there. A lot of them come from Inner Mongolia, which is their province, even though it was once Mongolia. But I argue that the U.S. should get more access to these minerals by investing in Mongolian infrastructure. Mongolia will benefit from increased investment in their economy, so they have all these resources, but they don't have the ability to mine them because mining equipment and mining expertise is very expensive and difficult to come by, and they don't have that yet because they're still building their mining economy. So the U.S. does a lot of mining, obviously, for oil and natural gas and everything. So we have the expertise, and we have the companies that have done it for years and years. So we should get in there and assist Mongolian companies in setting up their infrastructure and take our cut, basically, and make ourselves wealthy and reduce our dependence on Chinese minerals. Um, I argue then that Mongolia should adopt light manufacturing. It's because a commodities-based economy is, only good for so long, and it's so subject to booms and busts. So a lot of manufacturing is moving out of China, surprisingly, because it's becoming more and more expensive to manufacture there. Like a lot of light manufacturing, like clothes and textiles, are actually going to India, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. It's like one of the world's largest clothing manufacturers now. So I argue that Mongolia should kind of pick up on some of that manufacturing that's leaving China, especially now that a lot of the world is very hesitant to work with Chinese manufacturers because of the COVID crisis, and people are seeing that it's not great to rely on a country that doesn't like us very much to manufacture our essential, masks and gloves and gowns. I, I argue that Mongolia should fill that void. You know, there's nothing but space in Mongolia. It's the 18th largest country in the world. It's the least densely populated country in the world. So there's plenty of space to do it. Um, I talked about how shipping and transportation would be the biggest issue, right? They're landlocked, so you'd have to get the manufactured goods or minerals out of there somehow. But I kind of argued that you know you would want to ship it by ground because it's the cheapest way. You don't want to ship it by air; it's too expensive. So you could pay money to China through their Belt and Road Initiative because they're expanding trade networks all throughout the whole world, really, but starting a lot in East Asia. So maybe we could pay China to ship using their shipping lanes and stuff. So China would still be getting some money from us, but they won't be getting the full benefit. You just pay them the tax or whatever that they charge to use their shipping, and then we could move the minerals to the U.S. or to our allies in Europe and such. Um,